I just want to say good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bernie Connolly, and on behalf of Cork Environmental Forum and Cork Nature Network, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for being here this morning to what is really a unique 1916 event in relation to nature. And it's very fitting as well that we have this event in the middle of what is Biodiversity Week in Ireland. And on Sunday, as you may know, it's UN International Biodiversity Day. So I suppose today we are really lucky to have three great speakers, and we will get insights and reflections from Liam Lycett from the National Biodiversity Data Centre, Ted Cook, who's a heritage specialist, and our own CEF, Dr. Darren McAdam O'Connell, who will look at the whole area of agriculture. And what we're really looking at is we're looking back, what was our environment in terms of habitat, species in 1916, and how have we changed the landscape through agriculture and forestry in particular, and what is our environment like now at this present moment. So they were intrinsically in touch with what was around them in that period, and I suppose romantically maybe, but I think there is a grain of truth that some of the motivation for people wanting freedom was to be in control of that wonderful natural asset that we had on this island. So I suppose we linked that element, with 1916, and that there was an appreciation of the nature around them. And I suppose one of the questions that I would ask is, with getting that freedom and in the intervening 100 years, have we done it justice? Have we treated our environment in the way that perhaps some of those people would have liked it to have been treated? And I'm not too sure, but I think the insights that we will get from Liam, Ted and Darren will throw more light on that. I suppose the other thing is our logo. We created a specific logo for this event, which features the corn bunting. And I know that Dara Fitzpatrick, and could Dara make himself known? Because I know he's here. So Dara is the person who last sighted the corn bunting on Cape Clear in 2006. And that's 10 years. And I'm not sure, what the time period that has to lapse, and maybe Liam can, give us that insight before a species is extinct, particularly in a particular area. But it's 10 years since that sighting, and we put that on there. There's also the Japanese knotweed is the leaf of that is the other part of the logo. But I suppose there are positives too. We've been, in recent years, the egret has come to live in our locality, and firstly in Rosscarbery in West Cork, and it has gained territory around, and I don't think it has any adverse impacts, I'm not sure, but it has been there, so there are good stories as well. So just to say that Breda Moriarty as well from the Biological Earth and Environmental Sciences is here, and Breda, maybe if you just let people know who you are. During the break, Breda is just doing a very short independent survey. It's nothing to do with this event in particular, but it's just a one-page survey of outreach events, and she'd appreciate if people would participate in that. There's no obligation to, but we would appreciate if you would, help Breda out with that. So I suppose without any further ado, I'll just mention Eddie Noonan, who's here from Frameworks. This is being filmed, and it was part of what we agreed to. We got some funding from Cork City and Cork County Council, and there'll be a display in the Vision Centre in the city as well afterwards. So it's recording the event and just capturing what is the information that's put forward here today. So I suppose without any further ado, I'd invite Liam Lycett from the National Biodiversity Data Centre. He's the director of the centre, and we're delighted that Liam is here, and he'll cover the whole area of habitat and species.
The title is actually quite dry, right? Wildlife species changes since 1916. What's it all about? From my perspective, it's a personalised thing. What does it mean, nature conservation? I remember my father telling me frequently that when he was a young lad living 2 miles from Dowa, North Kerry, going home in the evening from the village, he'd be talking to his mates and they'd be deafened by the sound of the corncrake calling. I just thought, it's such a shame that I have not been able to experience that sound, that living countryside. We used to go along the shore of the river when we were looking for bait for fishing for eels and fish, and we just turn over a stone or take up a handful of moss, and it would be teeming with what we called as eel fry. As an experiment a number of years ago, I went down onto the shore and looked. I couldn't find one. This is a dramatic change that's happening, and I have 4 children, and it's just a shame that they won't experience this. So where are we going? You know, this is what it's all about. So that's what I want to try to talk. Conservation is something that we all feel passionately about, and we need to keep that in mind. And I say that as a technocrat that I've become, and I'll talk a small bit more about that. Okay, so we know, I mentioned already, we know that biodiversity is in decline. We know things are happening that are fairly dramatic. There's the iconic changes, let's say, or things, that events that have happened, which happened, granted, before 1916. The last great auk was sighted off the Waterford Harbour. It's extinct globally. We'll never see it again. And then in an Irish context, Ireland was once was known as Wolfland because of the numbers of wolves that we have roaming the countryside and the amounts of pelts that were exported from Ireland. And of course, it's 200 years since the last wolf roamed the Irish countryside. These are the kind of iconic events. But we also know that the smaller, insignificant, less significant little creatures are also suffering changes dramatically. Ireland is absolutely vitally important internationally for non-marine molluscs. These are snails and slugs to you and me. And we have a number of populations that are of international importance. There are somewhere in the region of 4 or 5 of these species have become extinct in the last 100 years. There's also things like mosses. I think there's 6 species of moss that have become extinct because of various changes. The cutting of peat of the raised bogs is one decline for these. But interestingly enough, this species here on the left-hand side, it's associated with earthen banks of old houses. And that has become extinct. Well, fortunately, we're no longer living in mud dwellings. So there's a very strong connection between society, ourselves, and nature. All the time is reflected. And again, one species of butterfly has become extinct. Granted, not since 1916, but it's a real shame that we can't go out and watch the mountain ringlet on absolutely majestic raised bogs where it occurred. And again, things like water beetles. I think there's been a number of extinctions there. So the point is, we know that there's declines. The countryside is changing dramatically, and it hasn't all started since 1970. Mind you, the rate at which it's happened has been dramatic. It's a continuum. We have changed throughout society. Biodiversity is all the time interacting with us and trying to survive, and we have a huge impact. Humans have a huge impact on biodiversity. There's been a big change, I think, since perhaps around 2000, in that we're beginning to build the evidence base. We're beginning to collect quantitative data. We're beginning to do research that can actually begin to quantify what's happening. We're beginning to get a better handle on what's happening in the Irish countryside. I mentioned the decline of hay meadows in Ireland. We can only kind of surmise what happened. We can't quantitatively describe the losses. We're now in a position where we're taking a more kind of evidence-based approach to conservation. And thanks to advances in technologies, and thanks to advances in recording, thanks to advances in our own approach to things, we are beginning to actually build up the evidence base for what's happening in the countryside.
From the forest comes our lives. She enables us to breathe long, deep, joyful breaths. Honour her, nurture her, continue to plant her, listen to her. She will always love you. Long live the forest. I just was taken by that because in my work with the Heritage Council and INTO, I'm always trying to come up with methods of coming across, not so much cerebrally and cantorially, but rather from 18 inches away, the realm of feelings, where our heart is, where our feelings come from. And I think that is it's one way of imparting what environmentalists feel. In fact, we now know, according to some records from the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, what unnerved them were the hedgerows. the hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Even the scarecrows were opening up with automatic weapons in 1921. So, but they couldn't handle the hedgerows. So I have a little poem here. It's a beautiful poem by an old woman called Mrs. Harding, who lived in Cork in the bicycle shop, which I think is now Kilgrews in North Main Street, in the North Parish. Leave us our hedgerows, O landowner thrifty, those lovely wild hedges that adorn Ireland. To salvage some inches of soil for your profit, must they be uprooted by the Philistine hand? The hedgerows in springtime with little birds nesting, with dog rose and mayflower and woodbine are dressed, while sheltering beneath them the pale primrose blossoms, and our shrews and our hedgehogs abide there and rest. How the town dweller longs for the countryside blooming, and dreams of green meadows and byways o'ergrown, and summer airs laden with the perfume of flowers, where songbirds sing loud and our honeybees roam, when the summer is fading and the harvest is coming, and the hedgerows hang heavy with secrets untold, and the hips and blackberries gleam rich on the bramble, and our rowan, most sacred rowan, shines out in scarlet and gold. Plough your fields, busy farmer, sow the wheat, sow the grain. By the sweat of your brow shall the needy be fed. But leave us our hedgerows, our sad hearts to gladden. Man lives not alone by bread. Have you not heard it said? I wanted to say that today. There were trees in Tyrconnell of the territories, in Erin's youthful yet remembered days, where now to cover the leagues of bogland lonely, there's only heather, there's gorse ablaze. Where rivers go from source to mouth unshaded, where shine in desolate moors the scattered lakes, and sedges only now where once grew the great willows, and curlews where were deer in our woodland breaks. The spades of peasants, oft the peat uplifting, strike at bog-black roots of oak and red of fir. And then 'tis known, there the primeval forest was murmurous to all the winds with its leaves astir, where to the sky's blue rim the heath unending lies bare before the honey-searching bees, o'er the camping hosts once spread the giant branches of oaks in autumn sounding like the seas. There was no mountain of our many mountains, there was no voiceful watered purple glen without its share of scarlet berried ashes, without its nut trees by the water then. I remind you, a hazelnut has more protein than a hen's egg. Round every dune of every royal chiefdom, white apple boughs shook down their blossomy showers, and up the craggy heights like armies marching went our Scots pine, our native pine tree, straight as spears and tall as towers. Fallen in Erin are these leafy forests. Our oak lies buried under bogland mould. Only in legends dim are they remembered. Only in the forgotten books is their intense story told. But seers, all here, who dream of times to come now promise, forests must rise again where perished these, and of the desolate land, our desolate land, it must be spoken. In Tyrconnell of the territories there are trees, but I still argue Ireland is not wasted on the Irish. It is being said that when autonomy was returned to the Irish race, they wasted their water, their trees. There were no trees left. What we've got to start again is recreate the native forest. And finally, I want to acknowledge Liam Lysaght, who was an ecologist in the Heritage Council 20 years ago. I think I can nearly quote Liam. During the 1996 Growing for the Future, when the government wanted to increase forestry, commercial forestry, to 17% from the current 7%, I supported the Heritage Council, who expressed a concern that commercial forestry might overwhelm, I think was your word, might overwhelm our gorgeous little green island. And Professor Convery of Antoshka, I remember him saying in 1996, be very careful, the primacy of profit and timber production as an exclusive goal will destroy the Irish people. I mean, we're an oak people. We're an oak people. We're not a toilet paper race. Thank you very much.
1916 was a pivotal time historically, you know, for political history. It wasn't very much a pivotal time for agriculture. And you'll find that photographers back then did not take pictures of fields. You know, the longest preparation for this talk was actually trying to find a picture of the countryside, anywhere from about 1880 to 1925. You can. So what I've got there is I have a picture from, I think it's Belcoo in County Fermanagh, and they only took pictures when there was something happening, but you can see in the background a lane, a field, a hedge. And you've got a very similar scene today in that you've got a lane, a field, a hedge. What's the difference? The difference is the gate and the width of the gate. And while talking about what's changed between 1916 and today, I think it's very important, and it'd be very disingenuous, it'd be very misleading if I didn't say one of the biggest things that we need to focus on is how much continuity there is in agriculture. If you look at those two pictures, nothing much really has changed. Now, if you get down, you know, square bashing and you look at the species composition of the grass or whatever, you will find a loss of diversity, you'll find improved grassland rather than native, you know, wildflowers within the grassland. But there hasn't been an enormous change. Now, just to think about why is it important that we talk about the change between 1916 and today, and why do we take stock? Well, if you don't know where you're coming from, it's very hard to know where you're going. So, this is a very typical farm, and I think that was around 1800. But it wouldn't have looked much more difficult in 1916. There was a big difference between 1800 and 1840 in that the population grew in those small areas you saw on the map on the west coast with a dense population, and after the famine, that's where the people disappeared. The great bulk of the countryside, the 6 million hectares which you do want to live that were mostly stolen, didn't see such a dramatic change. And you'll see there, that's a very typical layout of a farm today, except there's one difference. Can people see what would be different today compared to then? The labourers' cottages. Now, if we want to talk about the difference in the countryside between 1916 and today, the countryside was made up of farmers and a large amount of landless labourers. Today, the labourers have vanished and been replaced by machinery. And you would still see that string of houses, but rather than them being labourers' cottages, they'd be commuters' bungalows. And that's one of the most fundamental changes, is that the agricultural labourer, who often had a small little plot at the back, the lubgirt of Old Irish, to grow their you know, quarter acre of potatoes, a couple of cabbage, a couple of carrots and whatever else, they've vanished. They're gone. They've been the people that emigrated through the course of the 20th century. And to a large extent, they have been replaced by the younger sons of farmers becoming commuters to the city, building a bungalow on the farm. Mechanisation. We mentioned how the labourers were replaced by machines. And that had a big effect in certain ways. It's probably one of the biggest changes. We still have huge amounts of grassland. We still have the scattering of arable. And we still have the hedgerows. To a large extent, the hedgerows were removed because it makes it easier for machines. If you have a guy coming along with a scythe, it doesn't make much difference as a hedge. If you've got a giant massey with a big, you know, silage cutter or combine or whatever, it's got to fit through the gaps. So you'll see in the first picture, what was the one difference? The narrow entrance, well big enough for a cart to go through, was replaced by the big double gates to get the big machinery through. That big machinery also meant that the arable field that would have taken 3 days to cut and given plenty room for the corn crake and the corn bunting to move off is cut in 2 hours. And that's the change in habitat. For 364 days of the year, the habitat in that field hasn't changed dramatically. But for 2 days, what used to take several days and give them time to move is done in a matter of hours.
The next part is the visioning exercise. Can I just check, can you hear me? Am I talking loudly enough? Yeah, that's cool. So the next part of the conference is to develop our visions for the next 100 years. The three speakers this morning gave excellent presentations, and they've spoken about wildlife species, how our knowledge changed, the historical aspect of forestry and agriculture, and what sort of issues have sort of all impacted upon these three themes. So the next part has been designed to sort of use what we've learnt this morning and to develop the vision on what we would like to see for the future of wildlife and conservation and protection in Ireland.
Okay, we had a lot of great suggestions come up, and three that we thought would be worthwhile following up. The first one was having to think about how do we want to manage our coastal area, like the coastal waters. Obviously, there's a lot of biodiversity. Probably the majority of Ireland's native species are at the coast, and it sounds like there's very little area actually protected, so maybe you want to think about how we want to use that, perhaps have a target of protecting 10% of the coastal area, and you'd focus on protecting unique ecosystems and species just to protect a representation of those. The second one was, given all the flooding and things that have been happening over the winter, start thinking about how can we incorporate what might be called natural flood management in with your flood protection scheme. So that's just all about reconnecting our rivers back with their floodplains again, you know, letting them flood, improving or developing wetlands, and incorporating all that in with traditional engineered flood protection. That also has a lot of benefits for obviously wildlife and water quality. And the third one was food. Yeah, so start thinking about how we produce our food, perhaps look more at organics. Ireland's, compared to some of the big agricultural producers in the world, it's quite small, so why don't we, rather than try and compete with them using conventional methods, perhaps go organic and market ourselves as green, and then we'd have a competitive advantage.
So just coming up with a more coherent plan of how we're using our land. So at the moment there's loads of different competing ideas for land use, be it agriculture, forest or nature. We didn't really nut out the particulars of how this would be done, but there was lots of discussion around planting in particular and looking after our forests. So more widespread planting of native trees and more diverse species, so not just focusing on one or two species like ash and willow, but using the whole range of species. And we talked about doing a bit of future proofing, so setting aside protected areas like has been done now, but looking at what areas might be most vulnerable 100 years down the line, not just right now.
So I picked out three themes which I think probably cover a lot of what people have said here today. So one of them was restoration. We want to see parts of our environment restored. We want to see biodiversity restored. We had Ireland described by one of our members of our group as a green desert. So one of the things we'd love to see is wildlife, a wildlife meadow or a wildflower meadow in every town. Small things like that can go towards restoring our environment, putting salmon back into the river. So I think restoration is a big theme. Involvement is obviously a huge theme. We want to involve everyone. We want to involve government. We want to involve communities, and we want to involve our children. Another member of our group said there that you get the children and they bring that back to the adults, and that's how you start, and that's how you start to change. And it's going to be the children of this generation, the next generation, who have to come up with solutions. So if we can get them involved now, get them thinking about how they're going to start fixing our messes. And the next is value. We need to place value on nature. Now, controversially, that might be a monetary value. We have to think of things like ecosystem services, but we also need to place, to nurture the value that we all intrinsically have for nature. We all love nature, and we need to nurture that value in everyone. And once we do that, I think we're on a step to getting our other themes like restoration and involvement.
So on behalf of Cork Nature Network and Cork Environmental Forum, I'd like to also thank Cork County Council and Cork City Council for funding the project. I'd like to thank all the volunteers as well, to Katrina, who sadly had to leave, but to Karen, to Helen, to Aideen, and to Darren and to Bernie for all the help, and thank you to Cork Environmental Forum, for whom this event could not have done without you. Thank you.